Welcome everybody to this Conversation Starter, a program of the Jewish Museum Milwaukee. I am Dan Humschild, the Education Director at the museum, and I am joined today by a local historian, Don Anderson. We are doing this particular Conversation Starter to expand the dialogue and the discourse around our upcoming exhibit, Then They Came for Me, Incarceration of Japanese Americans During World War II and the Demise of Civil Liberties, which will be open in the Jewish Museum Milwaukee from February 17th through May 29th. But today we're actually going to talk about a few other groups that faced some unjustifiable persecution during those panic-stricken years of World War II. Because alongside people of Japanese descent, many immigrants from both Germany and Italy were also subject to detention without trial. And our local expert in this subject matter is Don Anderson, who has an extensive bit of knowledge about this forgotten or buried part of American history. And Don, I'm just so grateful that you can join me today. Thank you for being here.
Welcome.
Now, I'd like you to start by giving us a brief overview, if you would, about the persecution generally faced by some German and Italian Americans during World War II.
I mean, basically, it goes before the war even started. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, felt that it was imperative that he have a list of German and Italian people that might be sympathetic to the Nazis, and basically would be a fifth column in case wars broke out. And he got authorization to do investigation on the QT. And basically in the early 1940, he actually started producing a list of people that could be suspect of helping in case there was a war involving the United States in the future. So he basically put his agents to work to start investigating people that were suspect of being sympathetic to the German government and the Italian government at that time. And so they started creating this list, doing quiet investigations of people, and created this list.
Wow, that's amazing. And of course, not surprisingly, this wave of extra legal detentions affected members of the community here, given our strong sort of German heritage in Milwaukee. And it seems that you have intimate understanding of one particular story. So could you tell us a little bit about Peter Sierath?
I certainly can. Basically, Milwaukee had the third largest foreign-born German population in the United States. New York City and Cincinnati were also high on the list. There was a family basically living on the north side of Milwaukee, the Sierath family. And basically the Peter Sierath had immigrated from Germany in 1928. And so he was fed up with all the depression and everything that was going on in Germany. This is before the Nazis even came to power. He had served in the German army in World War I and was wounded through his wrist. Basically, he was a lieutenant on a machine gun crew. In 1928, he immigrated to the United States and married his wife, Maria. And they basically knew each other somewhat in Germany, but came to Pittsburgh area initially, and then within the 1930 census, they had moved to Milwaukee. Well, we had the Depression taking place, so work was tough. Now, he was a machine tool type operator. As far as factory work, skilled, worked for different companies in Milwaukee when jobs were available. When they weren't available, he basically was on welfare, as 25% of the people were at that time. Times were tough. Once in a while, they would be evicted from the rental apartments just because not having available work to pay. During this period of time, his wife and him they actually wrote to the Nazi government and said that times are tough in the United States and we really could use some help here. And they received $10 a month for a short period of time from the Nazi government in Germany in the 1930s. He never was a member of the German Bund. They had a large organization here in Milwaukee that actually had a camp in River Hills area and had conventions at the auditorium downtown Milwaukee. Based on all the records that I've looked at, I can't see any membership. It seems like he was mainly a family man, a hard worker in the factory, but also quite loyal as a German, and was very thankful for getting some subsistence from the German government. Well, at Pearl Harbor happened, and December 9th, early in the morning, there was a rap at the door. This is on North Milwaukee area where they had an apartment. There was a family of Peter and his wife, Maria. There was a 15-year-old son, a 12-year-old, and an 11-year-old. A daughter and a son were the younger ones. And the FBI was at the door and said that Peter and his wife were under arrest and had to go with the FBI. They then left the kids there in the apartment. After a few days, Peter, John, the 15-year-old, basically didn't know where his family or his mom and dad had gone at all. It turned out his dad was in the house of detention. His mother was in a convent that the FBI had basically rented rooms and was interring German that were suspicious there at that location. The 15-year-old went to the police station and said, "My mom and dad are gone. They haven't been back for 3 days. What do I do? I'm running out of food." And so the police came there and basically took the 3 children to the house of detention for children until they could find foster, families for them. Well, during this period of time, Peter basically was in the house of detention and then was transferred to a camp in Kentucky and then Georgia, and then ultimately in 1943 to North Dakota. During this period of time, his son had no idea what his dad had done or what his mother had done. Now, the mother, Maria, she was finally petitioned and released basically on parole from the from the Catholic home that she was basically living in. But at that point in time, all of the furniture in the apartment had been put in storage. The children had been placed in foster homes. Now, John, the older boy, he turned 16, and the foster family then turned him out into the streets. So here he was, a student at Bayview or at Boys Tech, and nowhere to go. So after spending a little time on the street, he finally was able to get a job working at a bar, cleaning up after hours for room to sleep in the back, and eventually got a room, somewhere and finished high school on his own. But through all this time, the mother, Maria, finally was released about 3 or 4 months later, but she had no place to go. So she got a room and worked as a short order cook during this period of time while they were trying to figure out what was going on. During this time, nobody knew what they had done at all. All they knew is that we had a war on, and that basically now mom was released, but had no financial ability to put the family back together again. Peter was incarcerated, and they knew not why he was in any of the internment camps. Approximately 6,000 Germans ended up in internment camps, and 3,000 Italians And so it wasn't just the 100,000 plus Japanese that spent the war in these, but some also Germans and Italians that were suspect for whatever reason. So as time went on, they tried to petition. The Thebrats wanted to get the family together and move to Crystal City, Texas internment camp, which was a family internment camp, much like the Japanese had. But there was so much trauma going on that the welfare people in Milwaukee said no, they didn't think it was a good idea that this family would be put back together. And so it never did throughout the whole period of the war. Basically, they were separated. The children were with a good family in Cedarburg, and John was on his own, just providing for himself. Well, finally, in 1945, when the war ended, Peter was released from North Dakota camp, Fort Lincoln, which was the German internment camp in North Dakota. During this period of time, they had interviewed him quite frequently, and he had sworn he was never a Nazi Party man, never part of a Bund, never part of a, but he was a very supportive person for what he felt that Hitler had accomplished in Germany. And even at times he had said that he would be willing to go back to Germany. And so he never was able to show up as being, a very loyal American. And mainly he was just trying to protect himself. It seemed like in Camp Lincoln, there were the two fractions. Half of the Germans there were ardent Nazis who refused to cooperate with the Americans. And half were basically willing to do anything to help America and did not want to go back after the war ended. The Geneva Convention said that all prisoner of wars, because there were also prisoner of wars from Germany in the US. In fact, there were 42 prisoner of war camps here in Wisconsin, actually, that were in working, and many of these Germans wanted to stay, but they had to go back to Germany because of the Geneva Convention. So after the war, Peter came home in June of 1945, started right back in the factories, working, as a machine tool worker, a loyal worker, and basically spent the rest of his life as a worker until retirement and passing on. His son wanted to find out what, so eventually, after his dad had died, he petitioned the FBI on the Freedom from Information Act and ended up getting about 4 inches stack of papers with all of the details. And in those details, there was never, ever a reason why he was actually interned through the war.
So, but if we break down his story a little bit, maybe we can see some of the panic-stricken logic that was at play here, right? Not to justify it, but just to sort of unravel it a little bit. You said, I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but if I'm not mistaken, Peter was a veteran of World War I. Is that right?
Right.
He fought as a German soldier in World War I. And then he received this sort of pension from the Reich, the Third Reich, right? Now, do you know if that was commonplace? Was that something that would happen from time to time with veterans who had moved abroad? Would they receive pensions from time to time, or was Peter potentially flagged as a result of this sort of favor that he was receiving from the Nazi government?
As far as the paperwork that I have looked at through it, it wasn't really a pension. It was I guess you would say, a request for funds. His wife seemed to be much more political leaning. They had interviewed neighbors, and the neighbors had often said she said that Hitler was the answer for the world, and And so she had much more detailed, whereupon they asked her and she denied ever saying these things, but the neighbors had said she had said these things. So she had asked for help getting beds for the children from the German government, the Nazi government, and received money.
Right. So that level of sympathy, and then the actual communication with the Nazi regime, as well as the funding of, the sort of welfare support that the Nazi government provided for their life, I guess, would have potentially raised some suspicions, especially if it seems that at least one of them was fairly outspoken in their support of Hitler and his policies.
Exactly. Also, one of the interviewers had said that Peter said that he had sabotaged the French. The French had taken over the coal area, the Ruhr, and basically he said he had sabotaged the French after World War I because it was unjust that they should have that control. Now, again, he denied that, but neighbors were basically willing to tell the FBI whatever they thought they had heard or had heard. John, the boy, went to the Catholic Church and went to the priest and said he needed help. And basically the priest said, "You're a German and your dad has been taken. I don't want to ever see you again." So what he thought were friends during this period of time, they all turned against trying to help him. So he was really on his own in this period of time.
Are you aware, obviously in the detention system that was set up for Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, there were famously these loyalty questionnaires. Are you aware of any such thing existing in the German or Italian camps to sort of identify individuals within those camps that would be considered more likely to be released? It seems like, at least on the German side of things, you mentioned that a substantial number would have potentially soiled those loyalty questionnaires that they were given them. But are you aware if there was any sort of those tests? Because they were obviously very controversial and created a lot of problems for individuals within those camps. They were incredibly poorly worded, and of course they created a lot of strife even between families and friends within the camps. But did anything like that occur within the German and Italian camps, as far as you're aware?
Yes, they did have that at Camp Lincoln. Some of the German were willing to work on the railroad. Now, they couldn't work in anything to do with munitions or war effort, but some of the Germans, probably about half of them, were willing to work on the railroad as far as for keeping the railroads running, as far as the tracks and things like that, where half of them were basically in total rebellion against this, and there would be fist fights and basically almost like wars within the barracks of the supporters of Germany and those that were working on the railroad, helping the Americans during this time. They were still in the same barracks on it. The ardent Nazis, members of the Nazi Party, SS members, they were isolated. They were not in the normal camps at all. But there was a huge animosity, and they had these basically, as you say, loyalty type things, where Peter actually signed one in 1944 that said he would be willing to go back and fight for the German government. It seemed like there was a Swiss bank account that the Germans had established, that the prisoners could petition the Swiss bank account for spending money. But part of that was that they would be willing to come back to Germany and help Germany. And he actually did sign that and never did refute that signature.
Very interesting. So it seems that at least within the, as I mentioned before, the sort of panic-stricken logic that was gripping the nation and many of our government officials at the time, we can sort of draw lines between these dots to understand potentially why Peter was thrown into prison. But I also wonder if you might be able to comment a little bit about whether or not even something as absolutely unsavory and unacceptable as, being an advocate of Nazism is. I wonder whether or not you think, what you think about the justification for imprisonment without trial is.
I guess you, again, would have to have lived in those times when we had basically 2 years before the US joined the Second World War. And all of the information that we were being given was very fearful for the US. And it would be understandable where the average citizen would want the FBI to have a list in case you had people working in factories that would sabotage the war effort. It seemed like there was more fear on the coast than there was, in the hinterlands, but it was still there. And especially if you had I guess you'd say people that were very, pro-German in the early period of time in the 30s. And now you were at war, and basically these freedoms were suspended.
Mm-hmm. Well, and obviously if Peter, I'm not sure how much his position was radicalized by the fact that he was detained in this way, in this sort of extra legal way. But if he was in fact willing to at least pledge his allegiance in that way to return to Germany and fight on behalf of the Nazi regime, it seems that there's some reason, at least once he's already detained, to maybe keep him there. But I wonder if you have any perception of whether or not that detention sort of radicalized Peter. It made him more angry or more cynical about America in general, or what his perception was as an immigrant going from Pearl Harbor through the end of his incarceration.
Based on what I have read and the inputs that I have heard from basically family on it, he was not political at all. He was a hardworking German factory man who was very family oriented. When he was in the camps, I don't know if you can see this, but basically he made this for his wife, which basically says Christmas 1942 to my love from the husband, harder times. And basically you could see that he was family oriented. He made this one for his children, picture frame, Christmas 1942 from father. And it seemed, and even in his letters and concerns, it doesn't seem like he was very political at all. And his son said that, not being a member of any kind of German groups at all, that was what's so surprising to John through this whole period of time. And yet you could see that he even said in the interviews, when he was interviewed at Fort Lincoln, that he would give the Nazi salute in the barracks. Well, it was like, why? And I think it was trying to get along, trying to just stay invisible. His whole focus was his family and getting home and getting a job and providing and getting the family back together. And after World War II, he actually did get the two younger children back until they grew up.
And so you said when he returned from these camps, he came back here to Milwaukee again and just got back to work and continued to raise his family and lived here for the rest of his life. Is that right?
That's correct. He's buried here in Milwaukee with his wife, and basically, just like many veterans who were in the service, were been there, done that, and we're basically like, okay, life goes on. Keep your nose clean, work hard, and provide for your family.
Wow. Do you know, I'm wondering if you have any perception of how this affected the family. You know, I know you grew close to John's wife, John and John's wife, and I wonder if you have any perception of how this experience that Peter encountered in this incarcerated state during World War II, how this affected his children or his family.
Well, basically, I think John, his son, was still very angry, and this is why he did all this investigation. All of this paperwork was what he put together, and he was angry in that the Japanese received $20,000 for being locked up, and the Germans didn't get 1 red cent, and so he was very angry at that it was unjust, unfair in his estimation, that took place. You know, his story is mild in some ways compared to Arthur Jacobs. Arthur Jacobs, basically, his dad was from New York City. His dad and his mom and him, Arthur, and his brother were incarcerated in Crystal City, Texas, which was the family German internment camp. His father said he wanted to go back to Germany with the same, paperwork and work for the German army. And so right before the war ended, or right at the wars ended, the whole family was shipped back to Germany. Now, both of the sons, US citizens, didn't speak German, and yet they ended up in a German prisoner of war camp in Germany, and they couldn't even speak German. And a army sergeant took pity on them and ended up getting them shipped back to foster homes in America. Wow. Separated from the mother and dad. So, I mean, it wasn't quite as tragic as the Thebrath story, but he's got this whole book telling his whole story, which is, even much more dynamic.
Yeah. Well, it really shows what the hysteria of war can do to our sense of, I guess, common decency and logic and any sort of rational human connection, I think, in many ways. So I'm interested also in some of the other books. I know you have a number of other recommendations that you can provide for people.
There is a professor on it, Stephen Fox, and basically he wrote this book here, which is the America's Invisible Gulag. And basically it is talking about all the camps. And in this book, he actually interviews John Thebrath and finds out this and writes a story. Now somewhere along the line, he changes the name and sets it, instead of Milwaukee, he sets it in Cincinnati. But it's the total story of the Thebraths that are in this book, telling about that, and many other stories too of other. This book here, Enemies, Iowa State University Press, World War II Alien Internment, is also very much a very good book talking about Fort Lincoln. and how the internal workings of the barracks and how you had the pro-German and other. So there's a lot of literature that has now come out on this, as well as VHS videos on Crystal City. There's a lot of information that would give people an idea of this period that almost nobody knows anything about.
Yeah, it certainly has been skillfully buried in the annals of American history, right? Well, for anybody who is interested in learning more, all the resources that Don just shared will be posted in text form, and you can link to some of those resources in the description below. And Don, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and elucidating this very, very tricky part of American history and telling the story of Peter Sierath and his family. It's really harrowing, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us today.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And for all those who are watching, please feel free to come by the Jewish Museum Milwaukee and check out Them They Came For Me. It is generously sponsored by the Yabuki Family Foundation, and so admission for that particular exhibit from February 17th through May 29th is free. So you can come on by and check that exhibit out, and also see our list of programs that accompany this this exhibit. Not only Don Anderson, but many others will be gracing us with their presence throughout this exhibit, and it's sure to be an incredible opportunity for you to learn about this period of American history. So thanks again for watching, and have a great day.